Welcome to the podcast for Cultural Reformation. Today on the show, we'll be thinking Christianly about Marxism and critical theory. Well, welcome back to the podcast for Cultural Reformation, brought to you by the Ezra Institute, where we equip current and emerging cultural leaders with a robust biblical worldview through in-person training programs and a wide range of print and digital resources. You're listening to one of the digital resources, our weekly podcast. I'm your host for today, Pastor Nate Wright, and I'm happy to be joined by our founder and our president, who is once again on the road. How are you, Dr. Joe Boot?
I'm doing pretty well, Nate. A little bit tired, very early morning this morning. A little bit of travel disruption that happens from time to time when you're on these extended trips. But I'm pretty sure I will get to where I'm going later on today, if that's not a tautology, get to where I'm going. But I will. I by God's grace, I will arrive, but I'm doing pretty well in Tennessee at the moment, heading for Calgary, Alberta shortly.
And I'll be joining you tomorrow, flying to Calgary as well, where we're at the Spark Business Leaders Conference, and then I'll be speaking at the AHIA Alberta Homeschooling Conference. It's interesting as I see you with yet another hotel room behind you in your background, and you talking about flights. I was reminded that my son Judah today, I was telling him about flying to Alberta and that I was going to be with you. And he said, Joe Boot, he flies a lot. Does he have his own plane? I said, not yet, Judah. he preaches the wrong form of gospel to get his own plane, but
the not yet, I like that. It's the now and the not yet. You know, at least there's faith there that might happen one day. No, I wish. The only time I did fly in that sort of solo type environment, you'll remember, Nate, was during the COVID era when a friend of mine who owns a very small Comanche Piper flew me clean across Canada in about 13 hours so I could get to an event out west. But that was at sort of 10,000 feet with a single prop. Not the sort of travel you want to do too frequently.
You weren't finishing off any lectures on that plane.
No, definitely not.
Well, today we are talking about cultural Marxism, and we're going to focus in on critical theory. Last week, Dr. Joe Boot and Dr. Michael Thiessen had a great episode where they were talking about cultural Marxism, talked a little bit about Marx himself, where his philosophical underpinnings came from. Today, we're going to try to focus in on critical theory. And what we want to do to start with is kind of talk about how Marxism went from a sort of economic ideology to become the culturally pervasive ideology that we see actually in the West today. So we want to explain sort of how Marxism shifted from an economic revolution focused on class to a cultural revolution focused on identity, sexuality, language, education, and institution building. So why don't we start, Joe, by talking a little bit about why traditional Marxism, or why the traditional Marxist revolution actually failed to take hold in the West as an economic system.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, it's probably worth doing a little bit of a recap for listeners on what they may have heard previously about Marx on the program. But one of the important things to remember is that Marx, although people often talk about, economics in relationship to Marx, we've pointed out that he was much more. It should be pointed out that he was much more than somebody who was theorizing about economic life. Mm-hmm. His fundamental concern was to change and alter society. That the goal of philosophy shouldn't simply be to reflect on or analyze the structures of life, or to even seek to justify the tools of reason and that whole rationalistic tradition. In many respects, we could actually say, and this might sound odd to some people, but Marx was in many respects an irrationalist. he didn't believe that that at root reason was central, in the sense that he didn't destroy reason from a philosophical standpoint. What he did was relativize it. So he says, well, look, the tools of reason are just social constructs. And so what we need to do if we're going to transform society is to alter those constructs. So it was a kind of an irrationalistic turn in many respects. Some would say there was a kind of early Marx and a later Marx. And this is obviously true of many thinkers that, in the early part of their career. And Marx talked a lot about liberation and freedom from oppression and this sort of thing in the early part of his career. And there's a very strong irrationalistic tone and direction to his writing. And then later, it became more deterministic, much more a sort of scientistic almost. It was as though he was really arguing that a kind of economic physics, there was a sort of science, a physics of social life, of economic life, and that based on that framework, you could make predictions about, and this is relevant, comes to the heart of our question here, that you'd be able to make very accurate predictions about the future. You'd be able to say, on the basis of all of that, of the basis of this new science, what life and society was going to look like. Once you'd made those material changes in these constructs, then you could predict the way society would go. You'd be able to predict in a very scientific fashion. In other words, this sort of technocratic, scientistic mentality, you'd be able to predict what society would look like. And that's, of course, why Leninism, Marxist Leninism, went the way it did and became very much treating people like cogs in the machine. Like, even Stalin once said that, killing 1 million people was like mowing the lawn. They're just material beings, and that we can reduce human beings really to this sort of almost mathematical quantity, and we can make these scientific predictions about how society would turn out. And that's why if you think, as Marx did, that there were the constructs that capitalism so-called had about economic life, that they were just that, they were constructs, and that to change people's thinking, all you have to do is alter those constructs in society to bring about this, liberation as such. You can see how the thought in the Soviet Union was, if you just blow up the existing order, if you destroy the family, you destroy marriage, the family, remember, in Marxist thought, being at the root of the problem of private property, and private property being at the root of all these economic woes, and the sort of economic explanation of all social reality, which was what traditional orthodox Marxism was all about. If you could alter those structures, then destroy them, somehow you would just get this, kind of economic and social utopia would just emerge from the rubble. You could predict that you could make this prediction about, if you change these structures, then this new society will emerge. And all that we knew about economics, everything that we'd seen to be true about economic life prior to Marxism and its implementation, these were just thought of as, well, we don't need to worry about any of that. They are social constructions that are there simply to advance a particular class within society. It's, as Marx began his Communist Manifesto, as all of history is basically about these class struggles. And if we can just deal with those, a new society will emerge. And unfortunately, what was seen by these early Marxist theorists that we're going to be talking about in this program was that this didn't happen. This new world and this new man that Karl Marx had been promising did not emerge. So all of the emphasis, as you say, in orthodox Marx, who I said was an irrationalist, who thought of economic structures and all rational structures as socially constructed, as basically just constructs. This view that by deconstructing the social order, that this sort of economic miracle would take place, and the egalitarian, equalitarian society would predictably emerge as you implemented these changes. It didn't happen. And in fact, what instead was taking place by the early part of the 20th century, and then, of course, through into the 1920s, of course, we did have the period of the Depression. We won't get sidetracked onto all of that. And then the period after World War II, where you saw this explosion of economic growth throughout the much of the Western world. In the Soviet Union, things were collapsing and decaying, and people were being treated like garbage, like they were merely, as I say, cogs in the machine. They were just material entities. The value of human life, the value of human existence, the value of the human person was being undermined, and economic life was a disaster. And it began, the information about the Soviet Union began to leak out, right? So there were a lot of these utopian Marxist type thinkers in the West who thought, oh, this is just wonderful. Look at how the Soviet Union is applying its Marxism, and you've got all of this equality and productivity, and people are just living wonderful lives out there. And there were visitors, actually, intellectuals went and traveled to the Soviet Union and had very carefully orchestrated, carefully guided tours. But the information, of course, couldn't stay locked up forever, and it began to be seen that it was all an illusion, and that barbarity, brutality, cruelty, poverty, systemic economic problems that were dragging the country down were everywhere, and it wasn't working. So that history is kind of important, because to understand why we got to the shift that you've asked about from the economic to the cultural emphasis, which I think is what you asked, because now that I've said all of that,
yep.
I think how we got to the so how we got to that shift was in part rooted in this disillusionment of these Marxist intellectuals in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary in particular. In the 1930s, lots of them fled to the United States. They, interestingly, of course, they became very, very influential in the universities there. And some of their works really were the triggers for the main grist for the mill for the sexual revolution in the 1960s. But the fundamental shift that happened was radical disillusionment, disappointment, a sense of something's gone really badly wrong with the brutality and the lack of value that's being placed on human beings. And actually, these Marxist theorists began to say, on the one hand, you've got this communism under people like Lenin that is taken on this technocratic, scientistic, cruel, deterministic approach to everything. On the other hand, they saw the oppression of the capitalist society, which they saw as equally rationalistic, scientistic, deterministic, in its different way. And they said, well, both the problem is this Enlightenment rationalism and the undergirding both ideas, and this focus on, economics, whether it be in capitalism or whether it be in traditional Marxism, that it's going to be that everything can be accounted for in terms of the economic, that there's something wrong with that. That's not true. And the pivot was made to culture.
Right.
The idea that the heart of the question was culture. You look like you want to say something, so I should let you cut in here.
Yeah, well, so early on, if you're studying kind of Marxist ideology, you'll see, as you kind of mentioned there, that it was all split up economically. It was sort of the bourgeois versus the proletariat. It was, owners versus, employees. It was all economic. And then that shifted to kind of everything oppressor versus oppressed. And of course, you can, as we've talked about, you can kind of fit everything into that paradigm. So you can be oppressed based on religion, you can be oppressed based on skin color, you can be oppressed based on gender, you can be oppressed based on sexuality. And so there's this shift. And I don't think the goal changes in terms of what they're looking at as a totalizing view of culture, right? A domination of culture. But the access point changed from merely economic, because the French Revolution made it very, very easy to stir up the disenfranchised and the kind of disgruntled working class against the elites. But now you have people thinking in these categories in all areas. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit when you talked about how a lot of the philosophical and academic minds of this movement moved over to the West. So talk a little bit about the shift to what we would call the long march through the institutions, right? Where did the ideology come from of capturing culture before capturing politics? And how the strategic shift became, if we can infiltrate universities and schools and media and the arts and the courts and churches, those are our battlegrounds now. We can still have this cultural takeover of our ideology.
Well, intellectually, that shift took place first in moving from thinking about the external economic environment as being the driving force of change, because as you said, the traditional Marxist idea was bourgeois, proletariat, the employer class, the working class, this class struggle, and that was what informed everything. And if you can change that, you can change society, you can emerge, you can have this revolution, and the new society, the new man will emerge. The shift happened with regard to culture. Was that they said that it's that the internal, the external there overlooks the internal, and that actually culture is man externalizing himself, and so rather than encountering a set of systems, what we have to do is, the capitalism was seen as a racket pattern. That's what they called it. The ultimate way to change that is to recognize that actually the culture around us is a product of our externalizing ourselves. There was a psychological and inward turn in many respects in all of this. And there was a recognition that this relentless focus on trying to stir up a working, allegedly oppressed working population against their employers, or regarded as their overlords, was just not going to work. What needed to happen instead was a targeting of those cultural artifacts, institutions, patterns of behavior, organizations, academies, schools, churches, the arts, literature, all of these different areas, that they needed to be deconstructed and exposed as basically being still in service, as you put it, to oppression and repression. There was still this notion that essentially the Christian order was oppressive and repressive. We'll we'll talk more about that again. And that in order to escape that, the purely focusing on economics was insufficient. The new route had to be thinking about culture, man as a cultural being, and that it's the externalizing of ourselves in culture, in all these different cultural spheres, that actually makes the difference. And only when you've changed those cultural patterns and institutions will you see economic change and the kind of revolution that traditional Marxism has not successfully produced in the West, because they recognize that there were these essentially Christian institutions, marriage, family, that Marx hated and was working against, and the church, but also more arts, literature, the schools, the institutions, that it was these organizations that reinforced this false consciousness of Christianity that kept the workers and the capitalist system where it was, in a place of dominance. So you needed, and you quoted there, Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, who wrote some famous letters and material in prison, who had a profound. He was in many respects quite a profound thinker, but he had a profound and deep hostility to God, to the family, to marriage, to all of those things. And he talked about this need for a long march through the institutions. That, look, the quick revolution, that's not going to happen. We need a slow, long, bottom up, not the top down idea, but which was the traditional Marxist idea that, you just whip up the revolutionaries and then they change things. Yeah. But no, there would be, if you undermine, slowly subvert these cultural institutions through which man is externalizing himself, we can kind of establish a counterculture. And that counterculture in time will then overturn and subvert these structures that keep oppression and repression in place. And in some respects, of course, because there was an element of truth in what he said about culture, culture is externalizing something. It's actually religion externalized, not the self externalized, and that culture is at the source of the river of society, as opposed to politics, which is at the mouth. It's at the kind of tips out at the end. They recognized that the political, in some respects, was what came later. But culture was what was critical. So an inward turn to a psychological sort of way of thinking, that if we can change man's view of himself through altering these cultural institutions slowly, that will be a much more effective way of bringing about this revolution than trying to reduce man to the economic. Let's reduce him instead to the cultural. So it was still reductionistic, and it still had the same idea of an adversarial relationship between different groups within society, still maintained that oppressor-oppressed dynamic, but it pivoted to culture and it changed strategy to this slow walk through the institutions.
And what's so, I think, insidious about the ideology is like with any lie that has staying power, there's so many kernels of truth in it, right? Obviously, as an institute that's pointing towards cultural reformation, this is a much more reformational approach to the domination of society than the traditional top-down political revolutionary approach. It's slow, it's patient, it's like leaven through the loaf, which is where it gets its power from, is that it's actually borrowing from the Christian worldview about the saturation of the gospel and all things being slowly brought under the lordship of Christ, but instead all things being brought slowly under this false ideology. So we see this kernel of truth in it. And therein lies, I think, the seductive power of it, because the minute you start talking about oppression, right, oppressor, oppressed, you start talking about injustice, this is biblical language that's been co-opted by this cultural Marxism that actually tugs on the heartstrings of Christians who want to see justice. We want to see justice. We don't want to see oppression. We don't want to see tyranny. We want to see cultural transformation. And so suddenly I think it seduced so many in the church because of the language, the biblical language that it's using. And in many ways, Gramsci was, and Saul Alinsky after him were such strategic thinkers when it came to how an ideology can become pervasive in the culture. And I mean, how many of our listeners, as you were talking about that, would think through, well, Ezra talks about how does the lordship of Christ affect the arts and education and politics and justice. And so it's a counterfeit integration point. We talk about the kingdom of God being the integration point of all things. It's a counterfeit integration point. It's a counterfeit pervasive ideology that sees all of life in a particular way. And so what we want to say is essentially being aware of this history and where this came from is important if Christians want to be equipped to combat it, which we'll start talking about in the next episode.
We're excited to announce that the Ezra Institute is launching a new daily radio program called Think Christianly. Beginning May 18th, Think Christianly will air Monday through Friday. That's 5 days every week at 8 a.m. We will be launching on Faith Talk Atlanta, AM 590. Hosted by Dr. Joe Boot, Pastor Nate Wright, and myself, Michael Thiessen, the program will bring biblical worldview teaching and Christ-centered cultural analysis to a new audience. If you're in the Atlanta area, we invite you to listen and share with others. If you're not in Atlanta, you can listen online. And wherever you are, please pray for us as Ezra steps into this new opportunity to inform faith and reform culture.
Well, welcome back to the show. Joe and I have been talking about cultural Marxism and in particular critical theory, which is what we're going to get into in this second part. We've just gone through some of the history of how cultural Marxism shifted from an economic ideology to a cultural ideology that seems to have pervaded so many things. So now let's talk about critical theory in and of itself, which is where everything we just talked about kind of leads to, is critical theory and how it integrated so many of the institutions in the West. So Joe, why don't we start by defining our terms? What is critical theory?
Yeah. This is actually a really important place to start this part of the discussion, because I think one of the challenges, of course, when you talk about these social, cultural theories, philosophical ideas, is that they often use words that we're familiar with, that people are familiar with, but they use them in a different way. And of course, that's part of the secret, isn't it? If you want to sound profound and a certain amount of obscurity to the ordinary listener, the uninitiated into the kind of language is, in a certain sense, it's powerful, because people are made to feel stupid, that they don't understand what's going on with all of this language. They get patronized as though they just don't understand the profundity of what's happening. But a lot of it is just to do with the way that the words are being used and treated. So we're used to the word critical, criticize, being criticized, the idea of challenging something, criticizing something, and of course, being constructively critical. We talk about being constructively critical of somebody's behavior or actions or ideas or whatever. And then theory, we're used to that word essentially in the sciences. We think about the theory of gravity or atomic theory or the theory of thermodynamics or whatever it might be. We tend to think of it as a sort of hypothesis that you can test. That's how we typically think about theories. So the kind of special way in which critical theory is used. So critical theory is essentially a Marxist, an aspect of the Marxist worldview that they deploy as a tool. And if you're writing critical theory or you're seeing it in a book, it would usually be a capital C and a capital T to indicate that it's being used in the words are being used in this distinctive way. And so the word critical here is not just that you are criticizing something, which, we all do. The critical element is that you are deconstructing something that is believed to be a structure of oppression. So the criticism is theory laden, right? It's value laden, and it's already bringing with it all kinds of freight. It's not an empty wagon. To be truly critical, it must be identifying something that is oppressive. So maybe that's the heterosexual relation between men and women. Okay, there's a very culturally prominent illustration. There's a structure, and the critical theorists come along, those who are, for example, queer theory, and queer theory says this is a structure of oppression, and the theory now, you deconstruct the existing structure, and you identify what's wrong, and you then need to begin to think about who and what is going to fix it. Again, the theory element is more than, here's a testable hypothesis. It's used in a particular way, but not simply as an abstract noun, but as it's something that's actually actively transforming. So the requirement of a theory for it to be critical is probably the best way to say it, is that it needs to identify a structure of oppression. It needs to then show how and who that structure is going to be overturned, and how this situation is going to be fixed. And it needs to be an all-encompassing, explanatory view of the situation, so that you're literally just taking the rug completely out from the view that you're addressing, or the person that you're dealing with. You're trying to literally pull the rug straight out from under them. And this is why it's bamboozling for people, because ordinarily people who, even in the Western world, even those who weren't professing Christians, would have said, well, male and female normative relations, sexual relations, the marriage relation is a normal and normative structure within society. It's not a structure of oppression. It's not enslaving anybody. It's not the patriarchy. It's not the authoritarian personality. It's just, that's mum and dad. Right. and that's male and female, right? Yep. But what they do is they say, no, well, we are gonna show that you and everybody who believes this are subject to a completely false consciousness. You are blinded by a false consciousness, and we are going to liberate you from it. We're going to deconstruct that and show you that you are simply the victim of oppression. These are social constructs that are there in the interests of the powerful, a particular type of oppressed relationship. And it is repressing people. It's taking it's robbing people of their true humanity. It's robbing people of their freedom, their liberty, their joy, and everything else. So this theory is going to explain all of that. It's going to be it's not simply saying we've done a sociological study and here's the statistics on marriage, or here's the statistics on the gender dysphoria, let's say, and coming up with some sort of scientific analysis to suggest possible things about the nature of a problem or a difficulty. No, it brings a theory, a value laden idea that says we the critical theorists can see from our vantage point that you are caught in a false consciousness and the object of oppression, and you are the way you live, you are reinforcing a structure of oppression. You are an oppressor, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah.
The ways in which you've structured your existence are a form of oppression, and so for it to be a truly critical theory, it must identify the oppression. It must show how liberation is coming from that oppressive structure, and it must have an explanatory power that covers all of that, and even explains who's going to do it, who the activists are going to be that are going to overturn this, and how they're to go about their task. That's a critical theory in the minds of these neo-Marxists.
And so with that explanation, which was great, Joe, I don't know how many of our listeners maybe have thought through as deeply about what's going on at the root of this. So any of our listeners who've been with us for a while hear us talk about structure and direction, right? That God has he's created certain structural norms in the world. He's created male and female, as you said. He's created marriage. He's created the institutional church. He's created all kinds of areas, right? He came up with the idea of civil government. Those are structures, they're baked into creation. And then we talk a lot about they can be pointed either in the direction of rebellion or obedience. What critical theory really is an attack on the structures of creation. So this isn't just an idea that is incompatible with Christianity. It's actually an attack on Christianity and an attack on the God of creation. Because what is being criticized in the critical theory are the structural norms that God has baked into creation. And so when you can deconstruct, it's like, and this is why they actually use the deconstruction language, which is very, anti-creational in its language. They're trying to undo creational structures, undo creational norms, and actually showing that anybody who's living within God's structures in a normative way as God designed it is actually part of the oppression. They're part of the problem. And so this isn't just an attack, this isn't just antithetical to Christianity, or it isn't just, can't be compatible with it. This is an actual attack on the God of creation. It's a religious foundation, right, where there are no God-given norms, there's no creation order, there's no divine law, there's no providence, right? History isn't moving along at the whim of a creator, there's no final judgment, and man must emancipate, right, save himself through the externalization of the inner self. And so you can see how this not only creates a false creation, a false livelihood, and a false salvation. It's actually just an outright attack on Christianity itself. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why critical theory specifically attacks hierarchy, authority, and normativity. Why it is in the crosshairs of critical theory biblical family, male and female, church authority, right? God's law, objective truth. These are the things that are under attack by critical theory. Why take those things out? What's the end goal?
Yeah. You've identified it really in your description there, Nate. Some of the originators of these ideas were men like Horkheimer and Adorno. Dialectic of Enlightenment, I think it was called, was one of their sort of principal works. And it's very clear when you look at some of the essays of Horkheimer in particular that it is grounded fundamentally in atheism. So, when sort of some naive Christians come along and say, well, we can use critical theory, it's a great tool, blah, 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 as though you're dealing with some sort of neutral apparatus for criticizing things. You're not. You've correctly identified the religious root there. Horkheimer was explicitly atheistic. The Marxists, materialists, are explicitly atheistic. They see absolutely no room for God except man himself, as in his collective consciousness becoming God. In that sense, God is the ultimate oppressor, effectively, the ultimate false consciousness that we've projected from our own minds to reinforce structures of oppression. The appeal to the objective, the idea even of objectivity, is a nonsense for the cultural Marxists, for the critical theorists, because you only ever criticize from the relative position of your standpoint. So at the root of the thinking of the leaders of this movement is atheism, is materialism, and is the view that God and the church, religion, they would say in the narrow sense, that the Christian church in particular has been a participant and a cheerleader for, Horkheimer would argue, imperialism and slavery and, all the ills of the world, are placed at the foot of the church and the family, and projected back onto that God. Now, you talked about the structures that are targeted, and I think that was a particularly insightful point, is that, as I say, this isn't just about the traditional sense of, we've got a theory over here, a hypothesis here, and a hypothesis over there, and now let's go and look at the facts to see which hypothesis measures up. No, it's saying that your facts are constructs. The reality is your construct, and that the hierarchies, and by the hierarchies that you mentioned and these structures we're talking now about, of course, the authority of God, revelation, authority as it exists in the family, with the father in particular, authority as it exists in the church, which is seen by the critical theorists as reinforcing both, obviously, belief in God and in the importance of the family, and even in the state and other cultural institutions and structures that need to be overturned. Now, you ask, what's the goal? Well, that's a great question, because we are actually fundamentally talking about the structures of reality itself. Now, we know and we recognize, and where they're onto something, let's always look for the kernels of truth, is that we recognize that because of the problem of sin, God's ordained structures for creation, such as the family and marriage and the church and the state and economic life and so forth, the entrance of sin has meant that God's shalom, that the harmony of interest that was built into the structures of creation originally, now experience a disharmony of interest because of sin. The Christian answer to that is redemption in Christ and the redirection of all of those areas of life in terms of obedience and faithfulness and righteousness and justice. The critical theorist answer is the destruction of those structures. And their idea is that justice is not something that you can ever realize now in history. It's always on the horizon. Therefore, you must always be overturning. There's no end to the critical theories. In terms of where's this all going, what's the goal? There is no end. There's no logical stopping point, because there is no God-ordained structure, and because all of human culture and thought is relativized in terms of your own standpoint and the structures of a given era. There's no actual endpoint to the realization of justice. It's always something on the horizon. There's no final court of appeal. There's no final judge of all the earth. So all judgment is immanentized now into history, in which you overturn these structures of oppression, but they never tell you what it's actually to be replaced by. It's why when you look at the popular movements in the street, we've seen it even on Memorial Day in America this week. You saw it during the whole Black Lives Matter movement. You see it with the gay pride parades and all of that. They're never actually telling you what are these beautiful structures that are going to replace the God's creation order. That's why violence and mindlessness and just, this rejection of all authority and all hierarchy comes through in these popular marches, because there isn't any specific structure that they're aiming at. In a sense, structure and hierarchy is the problem. And even though their ideas are really just introducing a new type of hierarchy of the intellectuals who really see your false consciousness, they're not religiously self-conscious enough most of the time to recognize that. And so where's it all going? Gramsci talks about his long march through the institutions. Wilhelm Reich and Marcuse, who we'll talk about a bit more shortly, who obviously, these guys are always demanding sexual revolution, sexual libertinism, right? That's the ultimate kind of repression. For Reich, for example, the sexual impulse, the orgasmic impulse, that's the meaning of life itself. Anything that stands in the way of that is oppression. So beyond this throwing off of all structure, there is no answer to that question. It's a structureless world. For Marx, it was to be a stateless world, a familyless world, a lawless world. It would this utopia just emerges. Of course, what really did emerge, and has always emerged with every form of Marxism, is a tyrannical, totalitarian state that's going to enforce all of these new freedoms until the chaos is such that it has to stamp down now on a new radical or authoritarian vision of the state. But just to say, before concluding that you had the Frankfurt School. Some people may have heard of the Frankfurt School. I don't think we've mentioned that yet. Back in the 1930s, there was the Institute for Social Research. And this was a collection of Marxist intellectuals. I mentioned, Italian, Hungarian, German primarily. And many of them made their way to the US in the 1930s because of what was going on with fascism, Nazism in Europe. And they came to the United States. So the Institute for Social Research kind of became known as the Frankfurt School. And there were a whole group of these thinkers who just started to develop these critical theories, effectively, early forms of critical theory, which were essentially destructive. They were about destruction. They weren't about rebuilding. You can't talk about an Ezra Nehemiah project here. There is no Nehemiah project. There is no true Ezra project. There is only criticism, and criticism that is effectively from nowhere, from a relativistic base, and nothing is proposed to ultimately put in its place. It's just revolutionary rage. And that's why you get to see all the screaming on the streets, the George Soros, paid shills. It's because they don't have an answer to the question you've posed.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because ultimately all of these false views, they attack the true worldview. They attack the true reality that Christ has created the world with telos. But there's nothing to replace it with. There's no positive vision for the future. It's just, as you said, sort of endless cycles. And in that, I hope our listeners, paganism that comes to mind is the endless cycles of reality, and it would just be endless revolutions. And it's worth noting that we haven't talked at all about intersectionality, but this idea that because critical theory looks at all these various oppressed classes, you can be oppressed because of religion, you can be oppressed because of skin color, you can be oppressed because of gender, you can be oppressed because of sexual identity. And so what it does is it actually creates an identity that the more oppressed identities that you have, the greater voice you ought to have in summoning the new utopia. And so what it's doing is it's actually creating a group of people who are looking at themselves as who can be the most victimized, who can be the most oppressed, because that's where I get the most amount of power, which is interesting because what they're trying to do is subvert power, but it's actually all just a power grab. But they gain power through different means. And so it's this endless cycle of, as you said, rage. And I think it doesn't take Christians long to look at the world around us and see that we are the product of the church church and the culture adopting this critical theory. And that's why we see everything politicized now. And I think it's important for us to just say in conclusion that critical theory, it's training society to be full of rage, suspicion, resentment, right? It teaches them to see creation order as oppression and liberation as freedom from God's structural norms. So Christians, we can't baptize this framework. As Joe said, it's not a tool to be used. We have to expose it and replace it with a true biblical worldview.
If you've been listening to the Ezra Institute's podcast for Cultural Reformation for a while, we'd like to warn you of a few side effects that may be included.
Side effects may include dizziness, mental fatigue, sudden distrust of anything neutral, frequent use of the term worldview, quoting Joe Boot without warning, the inexplicable urge to wear a salmon blazer, an allergic reaction to shallow thinking. Additional risks may include being labeled a far-right extremist, breaking into a British accent, increased interest in theology, politics, and culture, buying more books than you planned? Hit the subscribe button and share with a friend that you think should also suffer from these side effects. Warning: prolonged listening may result in thinking Christianly about everything.
Well, Joe and I have been talking about critical theory, about Marxism, talking about some of the roots of critical theory and how this isn't just a neutral tool that Christians could potentially use. That is actually antithetical. It's a direct attack on the God of Scripture and the creator of the universe. What we want to kind of show now is how critical theory, which we talked about and delved deeply into in the last segment, how it manifests today. We want to give our listeners the eyes to see sort of the ramifications of this and the manifestations of this in the culture around them. So what it's produced is the sexual revolution. It's produced gender ideology. The manipulation of language and any attack on objective meaning and purpose in life. So, Joe, why don't we start with the sexual revolution? Because that was in a lot of ways kind of the first iteration and the sort of Trojan horse that brought us to all of the gender theory that's gotten so out of control now. Not that it wasn't out of control in the first place, but why don't you talk a little bit? I know there's some individuals, whether it's Wilhelm Reich or Herbert Marcuse. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the people that got us into the manifestations of critical theory that we see in the world around us now?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that this isn't actually that long ago. For you and I mean, my parents are the boomer generation, and they were teenagers, in the 1960s. And it was that, the popular versions of it were peace, true love, and lentil soup, the camper vans and, lying in front of the camper vans and free love and make love, not war, and all of this kind of stuff. Yeah. What most people don't realize is everything that's going on right now in our culture in 2026, in terms of this struggle over identity and sexuality, everything else. This is just, we're still in the sexual revolution. So we talk about the sexual revolution as though it's something that's in the past, because there's we recognize a sort of outbreaking of it on university campuses in the 1960s. I think it was at Berkeley in California, most famously. But of course, it was spreading throughout the Western world. And what had happened is, and the history of the Frankfurt School is important here, the cultural Marxists, because they had fled Europe, they'd come to America, and they took up these positions very often in our Western universities. Yeah. They were given these positions, and they they used the position in these universities to subvert the minds of the young. There's a lesson for us there, isn't there? Absolutely. Christian education, the whole issue of education as a plan for the future, something that we talk about a lot as a ministry, the centrality of worldview, that ideas have consequences. Ideas, in a sense, get legs. They never stay just as ideas. That's right. Grow legs, and then they walk, they go somewhere. And so if you think that this was sort of bubbling away in the 1930s and in the 1940s and the 1950s, you got a whole generation being educated in this, and then boom, 1960s, it breaks out. And of course, it gets then reflected in law, because that's the time when we see decriminalization of things like homosexuality and abortion and so on. that didn't come out of nowhere. And I think sometimes we look back at my parents' generation, the boomer generation, and what they were dealing with, especially what the Christians were dealing with. And it's almost as though it appears as though, as you look at it, that suddenly this movement came out of nowhere, and suddenly it was free love. It was make love, not war. It was anything sexual goes. The family is as oppressive patriarchal structure. And it looked like it sort of happened overnight, but it didn't. And this is why what the Ezra Institute does, and what we talk about week by week, and what we try and impress upon people all of the time, is that culture is religion externalized. It's applied beliefs. And these theorists, when you think about it, were incredibly successful in their demoralization and social subversion of our culture through the introduction of these neo-Marxist ideas. And a couple of the key thinkers, you mentioned Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, Marcuse's book, Eros and Civilization, was probably the book that was most influential for the sexual revolution. Reich wrote a book on the sexual revolution, as well. Interestingly, Wilhelm Reich, it's when you read some of these characters, and obviously at Ezra, we try and do some of this reading for you so that you don't have to, because it's pretty miserable stuff. And there's a lot to sort of wade through.
Joe Boot saving you hours of misery.
Yeah, we're trying. The hatred and hostility toward fathers, in particular, toward marriage, toward family. I mean, he characterizes marriage and family in the most hostile terms. Well, of course, partly you look at the background of these guys. Reich's father was an abusive father. His mother was running around committing adultery, and the father became abusive, and because of that, didn't know how to deal with it. Drove his mother to suicide when he was quite young. And so he viewed the family itself as just this structure of oppression. He thought that a child, would love the opposite sex member of their parents. So sons would love their mothers, daughters would love their fathers, but they would hate the other one. Yeah, this sort of there's some Freudian elements in here as well, and that the whole thing, the whole idea of the family was to not appropriately shape, protect, and corral sexual desire so that it could be expressed and flourish within then a new marriage and family relationship. Everything was driven in his thinking by this notion that basically sexual fulfillment is everything, the orgasmic experience is the meaning of life, and everything that stands in the way of that must be destroyed, is a form of repression. Marcuse had a very, very similar mentality that the taboos and everything else within the area of sexuality were the thing that kept the certain hegemonic power. And that's another very important word with the cultural Marxists, with these critical theorists, is hegemony. And it means sort of the maintenance of the social structures as they are. So when you hear that word again, just think of, the maintenance of basically Christian social structures. And so these thinkers really drove the idea of the sexual revolution, that family and any kind of restraint on sex, especially the marriage relationship, this is all oppression that's designed to rob you of your joy, rob you of your freedom, and that to be liberated, Nate, as we've said, basically from God's order for sexuality, is true freedom. And I'll throw it back to you, and then I'll come back because I want to get to another thinker who was been most influential in this area in terms of how we got to where we are today on the whole gender fluidity, queer theory stuff. But that's how it began. It didn't pop out of nowhere in the 60s. It had been bubbling away in the cultural institutions, just as Gramsci had wanted. And this sort of democratization, this egalitarianism, this notion that you've got an authoritarian patriarchy rooted in the authoritarian personality of the father. It's all, and of course for Marx, the father reflected God, right? Or rather, the father projected the idea of God. And so, again, if you can crush the so-called patriarchy, if you can crush fatherhood in family, you're getting rid of God as well.
Well, that we were talking off air, and one of the examples that came to my mind was Raphael Samuel. It was in 2019. He brought a lawsuit against his parents. He called himself an anti-natalist, and he tried to sue his parents for conceiving him without his consent. And we talked a little bit in the last segment about what's the end goal here, and the reality is there isn't an end goal. The end goal is continual revolution. And what all of this reminds me of is Romans 1, right? You suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right? Despite the evidence of creation and a creator all around you, you suppress the truth you know about God. You exchange it for a lie. God gives you up to a debased mind. For anybody who has their mind rooted in scripture, some of the things we're seeing in the culture around us are ridiculous. When you hear that story that somebody tries to sue their parents for conceiving them without consent, it sounds ridiculous to us, but that's because it's the result of futile thinking, as is described in Romans 1, of God giving them over to a debased mind. And really what all of this is, like, can you imagine somebody who so abhors life that they want to sue their parents for conceiving them? And in his sort of submissionary documents, he was talking about, life is misery and life is suffering, and his parents brought him into this cruel world without his consent. And it just reminds me that all of this is ultimately a war against the creator. It's a war against God, right? There's a sovereign God of the universe who created structures in his world against our consent, without our input. And it bothers us that we live under a sovereign God. And so all of this is essentially a war against the sovereignty of God and his right to rule his creation. And so this is why we see the normative structures of creation. This is why we can talk a little bit as well about the twisting of language. They hate words like normal, normative, right? Creational, right? And or natural. Because what they're looking for is to go again. There is nothing that is normal, because you ought to experience anything, and somebody on the inside can be different than what you are. And so that they twist language so that there's nothing normative, there's nothing structural, there's nothing set, there's nothing defined. And it's a playing with language, but it all boils back to it's a rebellion against the sovereignty of God. It's a rebellion against God's right to rule his creation. And Romans 1 talks about the root cause of this is they failed to acknowledge God as God and failed to give him thanks. So we don't receive his created world with thanksgiving and gratitude. Instead, we rebel against it because we don't want to acknowledge that he's God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned them this hatred of life. The irony is that these critical theorists explicitly say, especially the guys focused on sexual revolution, is that it's the structures of creation that you've called of nature, of what's normal, that what is fundamentally creational from the Christian worldview point of view, that's the hatred of life. So that any sort of restraint that you exercise in your life is, let's say in the marriage relationship, where you're devoted to one person, that is a hatred of life. It's not to do with the blessing of covenantal of commitment, actual marital and sexual fulfillment within the marriage relationship, the blessing of children and family, the economic prosperity also that follows a marriage. That's demonstrably proved economically without a shadow of a doubt. No, this is all conceived of and perceived of as a hatred of life. And so you can see how it's satanic. I mean, it's diabolic. And they talked about having to release diabolic impulses to overturn the the social structures that allegedly oppress. And speaking of other parodies in this whole area of creation, the probably the most influential critical theorist in recent times in terms of the whole queer theory and what's happened with the use of language in our time is Judith Butler, an American Jewish feminist and lesbian who wrote in the 1990s a book called Gender Trouble. And what she did is, again, it's critical theory. Remember what we've talked about as the nature of critical theories, is that the language itself that we use, that you mentioned, husband, wife, mum and dad, male and female, these words, this language is itself a form of oppression. So the idea here in Judith Butler is that what we do is we capture the language, we use the power of the word, and we basically say that with our words, that basically the structures that we experience, the very idea of male and female is a creation of language, she said. So here you've got a language theory, basically, a lingual critical theory that's based in the idea of language, to deconstruct it and say, well, language is essentially political. And in fact, she would say that it was the essence of the political, that you control the language game. And that language doesn't refer to your words, male and female, husband, wife, don't refer to anything real. They're just constructs of our language. They're socially constructed, that they're created by our words, basically. So, of course, scripture says in the beginning was the word.
Yeah.
The absolute personality, God the Son. The word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, that life was the light of men. So there is the power of the word, and God said, let there be. Now here you've got God's image bearer, human beings, in their apostasy and rebellion against God, saying, well, we're going to take that word, but we're not going to accept, there's no logocentrism, which means our words do not need to represent the ultimate word. They're not analogies. They're not analogous of the word. We don't have to think God's thoughts after him. We can speak an alternate word.
Yeah.
You will be as God. And so Butler said that sex, that male and female, that husband and wife, these are fictive creations. They're fictive. They're made up of language repetition. Just by using the words, we have created the idea of sex. And in fact, she would say that, go as far as to say, when asked, is there a male and female body prior to their cultural construction through language, she would say it's an impossible question to decide. For her, the whole idea of male and female as created distinctions is fundamentally an illusion. She said a lesbian is neither male nor female. You're not born a woman, you have to choose to be one. Gender is essentially fluid. So if you want to understand, where we are with the LGBTQ22 plus alphabet soup today, it's intellectually, it has roots in critical theory, and in particular Judith Butler, and these ideas of gender fluidity, and that we create all of this by our language, which is this essentially demonic parody. So you start with the older critical theorists with what they would say their great refusal. What's the great refusal? The great refusal is we are not going to participate in the structures of Western, that is Christian society, marriage, family, ordinary working life. That whole idea of rebellion against working for a living, the gender roles of provision and protection of fathers, the patriarchy. We express a great refusal. Yeah. And we went from there to then with the critical theorists like Judith Butler saying, and actually all of these things are made up by words anyway. So if we just change the language, if we start talking about there being multiple genders, if we start talking about cisgendered and lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersectional, etc., 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 two-spirited, if we will alter reality by our words, because the words will reconstruct the social order itself. And so you have there a kind of demonic parody
Absolutely.
of creation itself. And the goal, as you said, is not constructive. The goal is merely power to destroy.
Yeah.
And we should not be afraid of that word power, by the way. Before I throw it back to you, Nate, I want to just quote Herman Dooyeweerd on the issue of power, because I think God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. And Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth is mine, and you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. So power itself is not wrong, but we can use power either to build up, to be constructive, to think God's thoughts after him, to build the kingdom of God, or we can use it destructively. And I just want to quote what Herman Dooyeweerd says. He says, many equate power with brute force. Today, many Christians, misled by this identification, consider it unchristian to strive for the consolidation of power in organizations that aim to apply Christian principles to society. They believe that power may play no part among Christians. Christians may speak of love and justice with an unburdened conscience, but as soon as power comes into their purview, they have probably lent their ears to the devil. Such opinions indicate that the creation motive in the Christian religion has retreated from the worldview of these Christians. As a result, they can no longer understand humankind's fall and redemption through Jesus Christ and its full scriptural significance. The unbiblical impact of their view becomes apparent when we recall that God reveals himself as the creator in the original fullness of power. God is almighty. At creation, God charged humankind with the cultural mandate to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Because of the fall, the position of power to which God called humankind in the development of culture became directed towards apostasy. But Christ Jesus, the Redeemer, revealed himself as the possessor of power in the full sense of the word. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, says the risen Lord. He charged his apostles to proclaim the power of the gospel among all nations. Power is not brute force. It is rooted in creation and contains nothing demonic. Only sin can place power in the service of the demonic. Insofar as power has been entrusted to human beings as creatures, it is always cultural. It implies a historical calling and task of formation in which the bearer of power is responsible and of which she must give account. So I just thought that was significant, especially in contrast to the way the cultural Marxists, the critical theorists, want to use and talk about power.
Yeah, that's really good. It's actually a good place for us to end. One of the things we wanted to kind of get across to our listeners is that critical theory is obviously not just an academic trend. It's a rival religion. It's got its own creation story, its own doctrine of sin, its own doctrine of justice, its own promise of salvation. It calls what's good evil. It calls what's evil good, according to God's word. And Christians must recover confidence in creation, in scripture, in the body, the family, the church, and the kingship of Christ. But maybe the best place for us to end is to talk about, and you touched on it there, that ultimately critical theory is antithetical to the cultural mandate. Christians are commanded by God to take the raw materials of creation, right, the structures that God has baked into the world, and create a God-glorifying culture out of it. We are to take dominion of what God has created. We aren't creators of the world. We are co-creators and taking the raw material of creation and building a God-glorifying culture out of it. What critical theory aims to do is deconstruct. It's decreation. It's attacking the structural norms of God's world, and it's actually deconstructing. And as you said, it creates a hatred for life, a hatred for work, a hatred for productivity. And all of this is antithetical to the cultural mandate that Christians are to live by, right? The Great Commission is merely a recapitulation of a world now that Christ has become a man and created salvation in. It's a recapitulation of the cultural mandate. We are to be fruitful. We are to multiply. We are to raise up Christians. We are to take dominion of the culture around us, and we are to create something God-glorifying out of it. And critical theory actually robs Christians of their mandate to take God's structures and turn them directionally towards obedience. And so critical theory must be rejected on all accounts because it actually works against the very commands of Christ. And so as we sign off, we want to remind you, as we always do, that from him and through him and to him are all things. To Christ be the glory forever. Amen. See you next week.